Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second webinar event in the fight against anti-Black racism and police brutality. My name is Harsh Naik, and I'm one of the organizers for the South Asian Allyship Network, or SAN. We're a group of young public health professionals that kind of came to this idea of wanting to start a movement for our community and engage in this dialogue and start getting more involved in activism and push our community and this discussion forward. I'm really excited about our event tonight and the panel of speakers we were able to bring together. But first, I want to start by acknowledging the land that we are situated on and that we are benefiting from in what's known as Toronto and London and wherever you are listening to this webinar. For thousands of years, this land has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This land is a sacred land and has been the site of human activity for over 15,000 years, well before what we consider Canada Day. This land is in the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy, the Confederacy of the Ojibwe, and other allied nations to share and care for the land around the Great Lakes. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, European colonizers, and then settlers, immigrants, refugees, and all newcomers have been invited into this agreement in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect, something that indigenous peoples have not received in return. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. As a racialized immigrant and settler on these lands, I, along with my colleagues on this panel, are grateful and privileged to be working and benefiting on these lands. Whether we want to admit it or not, we as South Asian immigrants and refugees are complicit in the systems that continue to oppress other marginalized people, including the First Peoples of this land. As settlers, it is our responsibility to become cognizant of the privileges that we enjoy and to start working our way to rectify the problems that we continue to perpetuate, whether knowingly or unknowingly. Positioning myself in the public health and medical field, it's important to recognize the role that healthcare has played historically and even currently in further marginalizing Indigenous peoples, limiting Indigenous peoples from their ability to engage in their own medical and spiritual practices, denying them proper access to Western medicine, and imposing Eurocentric thoughts and beliefs onto these communities in research and practice, thus denying them their right to self-determination. As a future physician and with current physicians here today, we must understand that our role and our image of doctors and healthcare facilities continue to be unsafe spaces for Indigenous peoples and signs of oppression. And we must work to kind of unlearn that and help Indigenous people trust us again. And we have the power to speak on these injustices and serve Indigenous peoples and communities in the ways that they want to be served. Now, this leads me to our topic for discussion for today. Here in Toronto and Canada, we have this misinformed perspective that our society was built on human rights and is fair and equitable. And contrary to this belief, our society was realistically built on decades and centuries of genocide, slavery, assimilation, oppression, and racism. And these overt acts are now covertly embedded in the systems in which we operate today. We see higher rates of poverty and unemployment in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, lower rates of accessible, healthy grocery stores, higher rates of poor mental health and chronic illnesses. And even during this pandemic, we have seen these communities disproportionately affected by COVID-19 in terms of cases and deaths, while also having fewer testing rates and resources compared to white neighborhoods. So now, how does this relate to us in the South Asian community? First, I want to urge everyone to go read Shri Paradkar's opinion piece that came out yesterday in the Toronto Star. She beautifully and critically highlights how we as South Asians reside in an uneasy place between Black and white people in an artificial hierarchy created by European colonizers. As Vidya Shah, a professor at York University, says, we associate ourselves with Black culture and Black people when it's cool and relevant and convenient, but we shift back to whiteness when we need to maintain our access to services or our mobility in the system. We become useful tools in the project of whiteness and white supremacy. And because we constantly aspire to fit in the status quo as model minorities and the status quo of a white society, we make ourselves more appealing and palatable to the system, making us easier to hire and easier to promote. And as long as we remain passive and compliant, we continue to be accepted in these white spaces. And this compliance relies on us not to speak up on matters that will shake the status quo, including anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. And unfortunately, because of this, many of us remain silent to continue benefiting from the system, or we are afraid of retaliation or exiling if we do say something. But we need to be aware that our communities would not even be allowed in North America without the immigration reforms that came as a direct result of the civil rights movement driven by the Black community. And yes, we did experience racism when we first came here, and we continue to do so, but it does not compare to the systemic racism and discrimination that Black and Indigenous people have faced and continue to face. So it becomes our responsibility now to fight and advocate for our Black and Indigenous brothers and sisters. We recognize that the South Asian community has not been very vocal or outspoken as a collective in times of human rights and social justice issues. But we aim to change that with support from organizations with this organization and from mobilizing our community. And this might be the start of a new journey for many of you, but it's never too late to get involved. However, we must always remain cognizant of the fact that we must focus on the Black Lives Matter movement and to support the demands that are coming from the Black community. Individuals such as Desmond Cole, Robert Maynard, Sandra Hudson, Anthony Morgan, organizations such as Black Lives Matter Toronto, the Urban Alliance on Race Relations, the University of Toronto Black Medical Student Association, and more have been doing this work for years. And we are here to educate ourselves, amplify their voices, and support them in their fight for justice and equity. I'm now excited to introduce our speakers who have been engaged in this activist work for years now and who continue their journey of being strong allies for marginalized communities. We have Dr. Nahid Dosani, Dr. Javeed Sukhera, and Dr. Ritika Goel. For the next 70 minutes or so, we're hoping to have a much needed and dynamic conversation about confronting anti-Black racism in healthcare and supporting the movement to defund the police. We will speak on institutional racism in healthcare, individual level racism, mental health funding, anti-Black racism in regards to COVID-19, allyship from healthcare providers and the South Asian community, and more. So we'll begin with about 5 minutes from each speaker, providing some contextual information on the topic of anti-Black racism in healthcare. And then we'll follow that with the discussion period where we'll also be taking questions from viewers. So please remain engaged in the comment section. We will have someone monitoring these sections and forwarding us questions that we'll add to this conversation. We will also be distributing a brief survey after the event to collect your thoughts on our sessions and get a better idea of who's engaging in our events so we can tailor them to the needs of our community and keep this conversation moving. But without further ado, I want to bring in our first speaker, Dr. Nahid Dosani. Dr. Dosani is a palliative care physician and health and human rights activist dedicated to advancing equitable access to healthcare for people experiencing homelessness. He's the founder of the Palliative Education and Care for the Homeless program at the Inner City Health Associates and the medical director for Peel Region's COVID-19 response for people experiencing homelessness. Now, he shares his passion for health equity through a broad range of education and advocacy initiatives, including national media, public speaking, an active social media presence, and faculty appointments at the University of Toronto and McMaster University. Dr. Sani, thank you very much.
Thanks so much. And thank you everyone for joining. Major gratitude going out to the organizers of the South Asian Allyship, Harsh, Noshin, and Indita, and many people working in the background. It's truly an honor to join Dr. Goel and Sukhera on this panel. I've been asked to provide an overview around anti-racism and kind of provide some context and put us into a position to have a more in-depth conversation. We realize that, many people are in different spaces and places when entering these conversations. And some people have been engaged in these conversations for a long time, and to others, these conversations are new. I think when people enter these spaces, there's often a desire to jump into conversations about, overt forms of racism. So name calling, insults, and that's a very superficial kind of basic way of describing what racism looks like. When you really look into our society and the kinds of depths of racism, systemic racism that we're talking about today, we're talking about covert forms of racism. This includes the denial of racism. This includes tokenism. This includes hiring discrimination. This includes, respectability politics, and that covert racism is often seen as socially acceptable. But today's discourse really brings us to positioning around working in the field of health. As health workers in our communities, we see the longstanding effects of racism in our communities every single day. People who are Black, Indigenous, people of color have higher rates of heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, respiratory diseases. We know that life expectancies for Black and Indigenous people are lower. We also know, most importantly, that Black and Indigenous people particularly feel discriminated against in healthcare. And many of these facts are often linked with social factors like housing and poverty, to name a few. There's a lot of work and research that needs to be done, but you do not have to look far to see the impact of racism in our communities. As someone who works as a homeless health doctor in Toronto, many people are shocked to learn that 2/3 of Toronto's homeless population are Black, Indigenous, people of color, and mostly Black. And this is at a system-wide level. And really, when you think about the services we derive in our communities, there is definitely not a proportionate response of services that are needed that would serve this population. When you look at pandemics, we know that from the H1N1 experience that Indigenous people were 6.5 times more likely to end up in the ICU. Around COVID, Black people were 2 times as likely to die as compared to their white counterparts in cities like New York City. We know in Ontario that nearly 70% 80% of people who've had COVID have lived in our most racialized communities, often coming from lower income backgrounds and living in dense communities. I am a palliative care doctor, so I wanted to share something with you, some facts that I've learned recently around racial bias and anti-Black racism in palliative care, and particularly in pain management. A 20-year meta-analysis showed that Black patients were 22% less likely than white patients to receive any pain medication. Black patients with painful injuries, such as fractures or burns, are less likely to receive pre-hospital pain management. Ethnic minorities with metastatic cancer are 3 times as likely to receive adequate pain management. In medical education, about half of white medical students and residents endorse incorrect racist beliefs, for example, that Black people have thicker skin, thereby prescribing less pain medicines. The history of medicine itself is wrought with examples of systemic racism and white supremacy, even using Black individuals as experiments. And so nowadays we see that biological racism and that kind of overt form of racism is not talked about a lot, but really implicit bias is more common. And shout out to Dr. Amit Arya, who's my colleague, who's compiled some of those facts recently. I keep learning from him around these ideas. When we think about how does racism cause bad health, there's been some research and we need to learn a lot more. But those mechanisms are important to talk about. Why is it causing bad health? Why is it causing premature death? Some of these mechanisms include state-sanctioned violence and disruption of relationships with traditional lands, racism-induced psychosocial trauma, higher levels of cortisol and induced stress, economic and social deprivation, around some of the things that Harsh was mentioning, including nutritious food, access to housing and income, increased exposure to toxic social, physical, and environments like that, and inadequate social and health systems to begin with, and the long-standing, racially motivated individual and structural violence that I think we're going to talk a lot about today. And I think as I close out this introduction that I hope kind of grounds us in a fruitful conversation, I remind us all that anti-racism is not a destination. It's truly a journey. And there's this really awesome graphic by my colleague, Dr. Andrew Abraham, where he talks about zones, kind of moving from the fear zone to the learning zone to the growth zone. And that's the anti-racist journey. We want to go from I deny racism as a problem, I avoid hard questions, which is the fear zone, to the learning zone, recognizing racism is a current and real problem. I seek out questions that make me uncomfortable. And then moving towards the growth zone, which I hope we're starting to move to tonight, where I identify about how racism has benefited me, maybe knowingly or unknowingly. I promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist, and when possible, I speak out around anti-racism and action. So I hope that gives us an overview for the next phases of the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Sani. I definitely learned a lot from all those stats you just presented. I mean, it definitely goes way deeper than we think. And also speaking at the end there where you talked about how being an ally and being an advocate is not, or an anti-racist is not it's not like a label or end stage. It's kind of a process that we will continue to move through through our whole life. So something to definitely think about as we move forward. Our next speaker is Dr. Javid Sukera, who is currently on call, so hopefully he doesn't have to leave us in the middle of it, but we appreciate him being here with us. Having said that, Dr. Javid Sukera is an associate professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry at Western University, where he also provides clinical consultation to the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Care Program and Transcultural Mental Health Program at London Health Sciences Centre. Javid was recently the president of the Ontario Psychiatric Association and has been chair of the London Police Services Board since 2018. His research interests include mental illness stigma reduction, implicit bias in health education, and facilitating youth and community engagement with the health sector. Dr. Javid.
Thank you so much, and thanks to the organizers for putting this together. A lot of what I wanted to share just relates to my own journey on some of these issues and some of the research that we've done looking at bias, particularly in healthcare. Now, I grew up in the Greater Toronto area, but have traveled all over the world, including the Middle East, and then lived in the United States for my residency and my subspecialty training. But coming back to Canada, to a place like London, Ontario, which is a unique demographic, what I began to appreciate is that Canadian racism is a unique brand of racism. In Canada, we, as it's been called, have racism with a smile, because so much of our national identity is built around not being American. it's really a different context in which we have some of these conversations. Dr. Kendi says that denial is the heartbeat of racism, and I think our Canadian brand of racism is one that's steeped in denial. For me, my journey around some of this research started with the lived experience of working in mental health and realizing that stigma, or discrimination and prejudice towards people with mental illness, is one of the biggest equity issues, because right now, if someone's struggling with mental illness, they're often treated like a second-class citizen in our existing system. So what we began to do is look at research on how to address stigma as a form of bias. And the whole frame in which we did a lot of our work appreciated the fact that the way we teach on some of these topics right now is based on a flawed assumption that there might be sort of good people who don't have bias or aren't racist, and bad people who do have bias, and that we just need to bring all the bad people together and give them a workshop, which I think you'll all appreciate is just flipping ridiculous, because the truth is we're all biased. We are all trained through experience to internalize some of these beliefs, and bias is also baked into the system. So early on in our research, what we began to do is suggest that education can be used for transformation, and that rather than having that finger of us versus them, pointing it at one another and blame and shame, those cycles that lead to internalized bias for people who experience this through the system, to bring the mirror to us, to look up at the mirror and confront our biased selves. But early on, what we found is that health professionals had a really hard time reconciling the fact that they are indeed biased. In healthcare, people would say things like, well, I can't possibly have bias because I'm a professional and professionals aren't allowed to have bias. But of course I have bias because I'm a human being too. So in our early research, we realized that there is a kind of toxic perfectionism in our culture, where just this idea of being biased conflicts with this fantasy version of ourselves as someone who's bias-free. And it takes a lot of effort to hold up that mirror to not only confront our biased self, but actually to embrace that imperfect person that we see in the mirror. That's a hard thing to do in the culture in which we live. And it's a hard thing to do when racism, bias, stigma, these inequities are built into the very system that we benefit from every day. What we found is that this kind of toxic perfectionism can only be confronted if we teach and talk about some of these ideas, like being anti-racist or fighting stigma, from a framework that encourages each of us to appreciate that we can still strive to be better. Like Dr. Dasani said, this is a journey, it's not a destination. But we have to actually embrace the fact that we're always going to be flawed and strive to listen with humility. I think my perspective is that allyship is really about that kind of deep, humble listening, where you don't seek to take up space, but rather to create space. And you appreciate that at any moment you can have privilege, or you can also experience oppression.
Thank you, Dr. Zascara. I want to comment on something you said. As people who have more privilege and understanding our role in this, and kind of recognizing our own bias and using that to our advantage. I think, we talked about this before, but understanding that in this journey, because we do have this closeness to whiteness, we are going to lose some power, and we need to be comfortable with that. That we are in this weird position of being in this weird in between place, but we need to in order for us to have more equity in this society, we need to be able to give up some power and some space for people, and that's something that I definitely have conversation with my friends and stuff, and it's difficult to get a grasp on, but it's something we need to address. Yeah, thank you. Our final speaker is none other than Dr. Ritika Goel. Dr. Goel is a family physician and activist in Toronto. She works with various marginalized communities, including people experiencing homelessness, migrants and refugees, people who use drugs, and transgender people. She has been involved in social justice organizing for a decade on issues of migrant justice and advocating for expansion of our healthcare system. Ritika is a co-founder of the OHIP for All campaign and chair of the Social Accountability Working Group at the College of Family Physicians of Canada. She's passionate about bringing a lens of anti-oppression, equity, social accountability, and social justice to medicine. Dr. Goel.
Thank you so much for having me. So I want to speak a little bit more about our privilege and our responsibility to act, not just as South Asians, but also as health professionals and as physicians particularly. And I want to share with you a little bit about our journey just in the last few weeks, releasing a campaign that people may have heard about called Doctors for Defunding the Police. So the moment that we're in right now is quite a unique moment, and this didn't happen overnight, which is really important for people to recognize. This really comes on the heels of decades of organizing and really builds on centuries of resistance from Black communities, racialized communities, communities that have been impacted by police brutality and police violence. And I think what we've seen is more a tipping point of what's happened in those decades, centuries of resistance and organizing. I think also within our community of health professionals and physicians in Toronto and in Canada, there's been ongoing work, there's been building within our community about these issues and talking about these issues, but not nearly enough. So what happens in a moment when there's a broad tipping point in the public consciousness is that we have an opportunity as people with particular privilege in this society to use that platform. And so, I'm fortunate to be part of a group of which there were many, including Nahid as well, that came together to think about how we could use our particular platform, our privilege, but also our experience as frontline physicians and healthcare providers that often work with marginalized communities. So for me, as a family physician that works with a lot of people with mental illness, work in the shelter system, work with a lot of migrants, refugees, and racialized people, certainly I've had many experiences where I've seen how police presence, police response can be extremely further marginalizing and criminalizing for the people that I'm working with. So in this moment, what I see my responsibility as doing is really listening to the community and lifting up the community's demands. And so that's what we sought to do. So we came together to draft an open letter to the city to say that we as physicians in Toronto area feel that it's important to listen to Black and Indigenous communities, to listen to people with mental illness, trans people, poor people, people who use drugs, that have been saying this for a long time, that what we need is actually to defund the police and to appropriately resource communities. Because what we know is that the communities that do the best are not the communities that are the most policed, but really the communities that are the most resourced. And I take that as a quote from my colleague, Suzanne Shush, who is a Black and Indigenous physician that speaks very eloquently on this subject. So we've I think really started a conversation. We've had about over 500 doctors sign this letter now, which I think is meaningful. I think it pushes us to think about our role and our particular complicity in structural racism in the healthcare system, but then also our incredible privilege and responsibility to act with the platform that we have. And for me in particular, being South Asian, I think this conversation is so relevant because we really do, as South Asians, sit in this in-between space where we simultaneously can often view ourselves as not benefiting from racism or white privilege because we're racialized, when in fact we really do benefit quite significantly from particularly anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. And that's something that is built into the structure and the history of this country. Our people were not the ones who were enslaved and brought to this country to work. We were not the ones whose lands were colonized, for whom to remove the police really were founded in this country. The RCMP in this country were founded to actually remove Indigenous people from their land. And in our neighbor to the south, the police were founded specifically to recapture African enslaved people who had run away. And we had similar issues here in Canada as well. So I think for us as South Asians who are, often benefiting from those structures and often can end up becoming the diversity hires in our respective organizations, it's really important for us to reflect on what it means and what we can do with our particular platforms and our particular privilege.
Thanks, Dr. Gola. I'm going to bring back Dr. Sani and Dr. Zukaira. And kind of follow up to your movement that Ritika, you and Nahid started, the Doctors for Defunding the Police. Why do you think this movement was so important, and what do you hope are the next steps, or have you been contacted by people from the city, or if you want to give us more insight into that?
Sure. So we haven't heard back directly from the city. People will likely have been following that there have been motions at City Council today. Certainly the motions that we would have liked to see are not the ones that were tabled. I think people will know that there was a motion to defund 10% of the budget, but that motion did not pass. There was one that passed that looked at creating non-police response to mental health crisis, which I think is one step in the right direction, but it is not certainly what the community is calling for. And in fact, at the end of the day, with body cameras being passed, it's very possible that we're going to end up with an increase in the police budget rather than a decrease, which is absolutely the wrong direction. So that's what's happening in Toronto, and we plan to continue to keep up the pressure and really continuing to connect with community to know what it is that they want from us to support.
I mean, I think, the Doctors for Defund Police movement really, if you speak to each member, we might have our own individual stories, but, for me, it really started from being a clinician out in the community, particularly supporting people with severe mental illness who from time to time would get into crisis. And, as part of that, it depending on this particular situation, the standard of practice is actually to involve police, particularly when people are a danger to others or themselves, for example. And I have not had good experiences with that. For the people I care for, there has been excessive use of force. And in the very few circumstances where I was able to get a hold of one of these mental health crisis teams, it was a very fleeting experience. They're not well resourced. They're not 24/7. It's not built into the structure. We literally have, police, militarized police, and responding to mental health crisis in our communities. And I think sometimes it's important to spell that out for people who are watching. And it's a vantage point that we had, and it was one of the things that drew me to the movement.
So I guess like a follow up to that is what's the why are police the first responders to mental health? Like why are people having to call police right away? Like what's the system of that in place?
So part of the issue right now is the way that the legislation works. So when we talk about, activism, for us, it's not just about producing mental change. It has to be about producing policy change. Right now, in the existing system, the only way to actually have someone brought in based on the mental health legislation is by having police do so. So if someone's concerned about someone's safety, the way that this system has been designed is it's been designed in a very coercive way, which I think is problematic. And we see the negative impacts, particularly on Black communities, Indigenous communities. So solutions really involve co-designing legislative reform with these communities and honoring their voices so that there's a actual policy change, and we begin to change structures to change the system.
Yes, Jivi, I guess I'll follow up on that point, because you do have an interesting perspective as chair of the London Police Services Board. I guess if you want to expand a little bit on what your role is as a chair, what you do, and I guess how do you balance your position as being an activist while also being part of this system that everyone sees as an oppressive system?
Yeah, I think that it's been a real eye opener for me. It wasn't a position I necessarily sought. I didn't imagine ending up on a police services board. It was a serendipitous thing, but it is also a really important gift and opportunity to bring that perspective from healthcare, from research, to actually co-design significant transformative change. For me, this is about appreciation that a lot of these incremental baby step reforms that have been called for, pushed over the years, they're simply not enough. We need a complete transformation of the ways in which we've designed our system. When we look at mental health as well, we've completely underfunded mental health. So, I always say to people, yes, of course, we need to look at how we do crisis and do it differently, but we need to actually fund adequate access to care so that people aren't in their worst possible case or worst possible situation to actually get help. The opportunity for change is an interesting one, because when you step up and you try to make meaningful change happen, you often do get a lot of critique. And I think that's an important thing, because we often, especially as South Asians, there's a lot that we look for in terms of opportunity. And it is really hard to reconcile sometimes that we are benefiting from the same supremacist system that we're trying to change. It's the same working within healthcare, when you realize that there's a lot of work that you're trying to do, but you're also actually benefiting from the power differential and the hierarchy. And I think one of the things I've always tried to anchor myself to is this idea of inclusive system co-design, really listening, engaging with humility to the people who have been oppressed by the system, and co-designing solutions with them, with academic and non-academic partners working together for that.
Yeah, I guess following up with your we can see, we hear you saying, like, you know, we need transformational change, but I guess what are the current barriers that you see, like, within the police, or that you feel like that is preventing that from happening?
So I think that the barriers are that the norm right now is a biased norm. And so there's a current that's flowing one way. And if we look at wanting to swim against the current, that takes a lot of effort. Education alone is rarely enough, because there's so much of what's around us that's actually a biased system. So change is difficult in that system, because raising critical awareness at an individual level is difficult enough to reconcile. But there's a lot of defensiveness, a lot of threats, and I think that we can all relate to that on a human level. When there's a system that certain people have been benefiting from, that we begin to critically unravel and highlight that's problematic, you're challenging power structures, and that's going to come at that's going to challenge people. It's going to feel threatening to people. It's also going to be challenging to ensure that you still have a seat at the table. I think that's something I've definitely struggled with within healthcare, is sometimes being a critical voice can be challenging, because then critical voices do get marginalized at decision-making tables. But I've had mentors and other people who have emphasized that when you're looking to have a seat at the table, it's important that you're not the only voice at the table. And I know Ritika pointed to the diversity hires and some of the tokenism that we've all experienced. I think firsthand that can be very problematic, because when there's systems or structures that are looking for meaningful change, you want more than just tokenism. You want people at the table that aren't just at the table to be a puppet. You want people at the table who are going to be critical voices, who challenge the status quo, but also appreciate the importance of the unique position that one might be in, and honor, again, Black and Indigenous voices who are really bearing the brunt of some of the violence in our communities.
Yeah, I mean, as Ritika mentioned, like the motion to defund the police by 10% failed today, and I saw, I think, a few hours ago, where New York City is going forward with defunding $1 billion of their police services. Mayor Bill de Blasio has put it on the table for City Council there to debate. So it's not like it's not possible. It just seems that, like you're saying, Javi, there's a lot of structural resistance and barriers, because these unions and these police services are so powerful, and they don't want to give up that power. And I guess, like, if there was, I guess, some change, or, you know, some, like what the guy was saying, there's some level of another system where healthcare professionals and social workers are now brought in as people to respond to calls. Like, how do you see the roles of healthcare professionals changing in this aspect? Like, do you think that doctors will have the capacity to do this, or social workers or nurses, or how will this work in practice?
Yeah, I think we have to be open to listening to what those solutions are that are being proposed by the community. I think, you know, from what I know, the folks that are involved in serving marginalized communities want to serve those communities. You know, I don't think that people who are incredibly skilled, that work in these settings with marginalized people, and you know, have skills in de-escalation, et cetera, actually want to call police. There's lots of situations I can think of where we may not call, or we may, you know, kind of forego some of the planning around what would normally be considered a situation where you might call police just because we know what someone's previous interactions are, or because specifically they're Black or Indigenous, or because we know how they might be perceived, etc. So I think absolutely the healthcare system has to be part of the solution and part of the discussion and come to the table. But I think at this point, we're probably more in the stages of really just pushing power and pushing those structures to even think about this as a conversation. I don't think that the problem is that the healthcare system wouldn't step up. I think the problem is that we have a system that's based on police responding, and there is a lot of power in the police unions and in the police broader structure in society. You just have to look at the Toronto City budget to get a sense of that, and the history of ongoing increases to the police budget at the expense of services.
But that's why, you know, the defund the police movement is not just about defunding the police. It's about, you know, much more than that. And in terms of the Doctors for Defund Police open letter, which with over 500 physician signees and growing, we're asking for transparency of budgets. We're asking for defunding the police and reallocating budgets to our communities. But we're also asking for deadly and aggressive force to be disallowed, and really for health. And this is our angle. This is a unique perspective that we hope to provide. For health to improve, you know, these three facets have to occur, and there has to be a systematic, you know, a change in power dynamics to address that. And as our colleague Dr. Suzanne Schusch, I'm going to quote her to Rithika, says, we can't police our way out of systemic racism. And you know, so these are fundamental parts of it. So I don't see us being able to improve the health of our communities without a total deconstruction of the power structures that have developed around policing in our country.
I do want to add too to the excellent comments by my colleagues that in healthcare, we're also part of the problem. I don't think any of us would think that we don't see some of that systemic racism within the healthcare system as well. I think that there's a lot of coercive problems within the healthcare system that we need to work on addressing and dismantling as well. We see that manifested in terms of which healthcare problems get funding and which healthcare problems don't get funding. And we also see that manifested right now with what's happening with COVID. I know that my colleagues were part of a letter that we sort of picked up on our board that highlighted that, for example, information sharing with non-health partners is highly problematic when there are communities who have a hard time because the system has violated their trust in terms of accessing help and seeking help. So we need to remember that there's a lot of things within our own system that we also need to address. How people get care within what's happening with this pandemic. You know, we're seeing a clearly disproportionate impact of this pandemic on certain communities who are really just not at the table when policy decisions are made. You know, why does someone have to speak English as a first language in order to get the care that they deserve? We need to be considering how race plays a role in all those decisions, particularly at a time like this.
Yeah, I mean, following up to that, like I think you're speaking to the order that was moved by Ontario to where I think there's a requirement that health officials have to share COVID data with police, and there was a coalition of like 20 social justice and health equity organizations that came forward to have this revoked. I don't think it has been revoked. I still think it's in place right now, but like I guess like why is like the first instinct always to support the police, or like why do you think this is having this access to this data is going to can be detrimental to these marginalized communities?
Well, I think that there isn't enough of a critical voice at the table when policy decisions are made. You know, I will go on the record and say it's problematic that we have a provincial government that pretty much decimated the anti-racism file. It's problematic that we've seen a stripping of the Human Rights Commission in terms of their ability to do the meaningful work that they need to do. So I think we have to be very careful in terms of our advocacy, and we have to be critical voices at the table when governments are elected. But I also think that we sometimes fall into complacent places with different types of government or different types of ideology. The truth is anti-racism isn't a partisan issue. It's about dignity. It's about values that we hold dear as a society. And I think the South Asian community, we often do fall into some of these complacent lines, particularly with governments, where we're not enough of a critical voice when it comes to elections, when it comes to donations. And I think that a lot of our advocacy has to go beyond our own door and our own power to begin to appreciate some of the problems that we're seeing in society.
Yeah, I think there's so many different levels at which we can take action, right? So we're talking about internal kind of, doing your own work, thinking more about what your own even understanding is of histories and structure. And I know that your group is sharing resources, but, I'd highly recommend reading about the history of Canada. I recommend Robin Maynard's book, Policing Black Lives. I would recommend, there's a number of podcasts that go into some of this history, like Color Code, looking at some of the Indigenous history that really actually helps understand, how would we end up in the place we're in today, where it would be a high priority to kind of get data about people to the police, but not be as high a priority to think about how that data might negatively impact people. That's about the history of our country. It's about the history of who has had power and who has been given humanity and dignity. So we have to do that internal work. And then I think we have to do work within our own spaces. So that can be within our own community in terms of South Asian community. For us as healthcare providers, that's about looking within our own spaces. And absolutely, there's a lot of racism within healthcare spaces, some of which we face, but a lot of which also our patients face. Sometimes at the hands of healthcare providers, but also structurally. And then there's also how we become a voice. So how do we organize with our colleagues in our spaces to then kind of think more externally and be a voice to support the community and to actually target some of that structural change. So there's a number of different levels at which we can act.
So I guess in terms of like following up with more COVID related questions, like there's been the discussion of making masking mandatory in the province or in the city, and how, I can only imagine how that could start affecting marginalized communities. But if you guys want to speak to that, and what do you think that they should do? Like, should they make it like enforceable, or just have it a recommendation?
I think, we have seen a lot of evidence around the role of masking and the Masks for All kind of movement in Canada and the benefits of it. But it clearly behooves questions around equity and, who supplies masks. I mean, I was doing a shelter-based medical visit last week and was seeing someone with a serious illness who was in the shelter and said to me, don't these people get it? If they don't wear a mask, I'll get sick. Can you tell them to wear a mask so us in the shelter system don't get sick? People are acutely aware of that. And I thought that was a really important vignette to talk about. So I tell people about that. But if you're going to mandate masking on transit and in certain spaces, this has to be provided to people. But I think it behooves like bigger questions around public health. And, I've been in some conversations around public health strategies around COVID. And there really has been kind of a one size fits all approach to people in Ontario, even thinking about literacy, the words that were used, language, like there hasn't been public health communications that has come in different languages, thinking about our racialized communities. And so I think we can be a bit more creative. And I know masks is at the forefront, and that's why we're talking about it tonight. But there may be another thing in a few weeks. And I think it behooves a larger look at public health and how we're communicating to service, the diverse community that lives in our province and in our country.
Yeah, I think like just like a personal like something that I was thinking about is if you do make these masks mandatory and enforceable, we've seen kind of the unequal treatment that police have given to people not wearing masks or not social distancing properly. We saw the Trinity Bell was example, or Woodbine Beach. People like a certain demographic of people congregating together and not being ticketed or not being told to social distance, and then you have police ticketing homeless people for camping in parks and stuff because they don't want to go to the shelters because these shelters have outbreaks. So I just feel like that, like in terms of masking, if you start enforcing everyone to wear a mask and you have people who can't afford a mask or don't have access to a mask, or I was reading articles where Black males may feel unsafe wearing a mask because they can seem as even more of a threat to white people or non-Black people. So how do you go about like navigating this issue and I guess like the whole racism part of it while also like trying to enforce public health safety?
Well, the enforcement is the key word. I think wherever we see enforcement, we're going to see disproportionate impact on certain communities. We're seeing that with bylaw enforcement right now with COVID, where it's very clear that there are different communities who are afraid in a different way of enforcement because our current system of enforcement advantages some and disadvantages others. part of the problem with masking or any other policy, particularly with the pandemic, is these policies aren't being made in an inclusive way. In an emergency, there isn't the kind of consultation and meaningful engagement that needs to happen. Yet again, flawed policies keep being implemented that disproportionately affect certain populations. We see that with other policies in hospitals right now, whether it's visitor policies, interpreter services, access to allied health consultation. We're seeing it over and over and over where things being rushed in an emergency are disadvantaging some people.
And I want to follow up with, we learned recently that the effect that COVID-19 is having on the migrant worker population. And yesterday we learned that 96 of 98 cases in Windsor, Essex were among farm workers. Today, 177 of the 257 across the province were related to migrant farm labor population. There have already been 3 deaths among migrant workers in Ontario, but there hasn't been kind of a statement from the government to the change in their plan for migrant workers to continue working even if they test positive. And migrant workers are primarily from Central Latin America or the Caribbean. I don't know, but I know you do a lot of work with migrant workers and their rights, and could you just provide some context to like who migrant workers are, like why the government brings them in and takes kind of advantage of them and their rights, and like what these kind of guidelines show us about how they feel about the work they do.
Yeah, I mean, it's again about how all of these different systems work together, right? So the history of Canada, structural racism, how our global economic capitalist system works, all these things come together when you look at something like the issue of migrant workers in Canada. So we have the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, through which we bring a number of different groups, one of which is the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program, which is kind of often when we talk about migrant workers who we're referring to, it's farm workers. So people that are out in the hot sun, day in, day out, picking our fruits and vegetables, literally putting food on our table. And there have been, some kind of exposés looking into the situations that they work in, incredibly crowded, congregated living situations, which did not change once we hit a global pandemic. So it's kind of like what, my colleagues are talking about, that you can have one almost reality where you're talking about a public health response that is based on an assumption of what people's ability to meet their necessities or what access they have, what their housing looks like, what their ability to socially distance or mask or isolate looks like. And then you can have the reality of migrant workers in Canada, which is that they come here, they do not get a path to permanent immigration status. Many have language barriers and are living in these congregate settings. So it's not surprising really that we've seen now 17 farms with outbreaks. That 3 migrant workers have died, one of whom was in their 20s, one in their 30s, and one in their 50s, when the large majority of deaths from COVID have been of people in their 70s or 80s. And now we're seeing a policy saying that even somebody who's COVID positive and asymptomatic should go back to work. So this, to me, is a coming together of all of those broader structures and systems. And it's about who has a voice, who has rights, and really who as a society we've decided matters. And even if you even look at who's advocating for these folks, all 3 of them were from Mexico. The Mexican government tried to pull back and say, we're not going to send any more of our workers to you because of what's happening to them. But even they had to eventually back down because of the way that power works in our society, right? That Canada as a state has so much power over a country like Mexico in being able to provide these very, very poor, not at all decent jobs, but they have no choice but to accept them. So, it's another situation where it's really important for those of us who have more of a voice, who have more privilege, to learn about these issues and to publicize them, to speak about them, and to put pressure on our governments, because migrant workers can't vote. That's one of the big issues. So how do we move towards getting a path towards permanent status for this population? Because that's one of the ways that they'll actually be granted the rights and dignity that they deserve.
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna take a couple questions from the audience now. So one question is about GB, the perfectionism that you spoke to, that health professionals, have this sense of being perfect individuals and not being kind of aware of their own biases, and they stay in denial of their own racist tendencies. So is there kind of like some movement or some kind of activism going on within medicine, either in the hospital or in school, to kind of learn how to manage these kind of changes to how people think and how they perceive their own reality?
There is, but nearly not enough, right? I think the problem with the current system is I talk to a lot of students who are encouraged to kind of compete with one another to climb on the top. And I think what we're realizing now as a society is that there's no meaningful rising when you're stepping on other people, or you have your knee on other people, or other people are on their knees. In the current system, part of why there's a toxic perfectionism is because people are afraid to be vulnerable. And that's because there's a lot of trauma. I'm doing a research study right now where we're looking at resident doctors' experiences of stigma during the pandemic. And a lot of very social justice oriented residents talk about traumatic experiences that they have when they speak up as medical students about things that they see that are problematic. So I think that there's a need for system and structural change. We have a problem where we try to take healthcare professionals and solve wicked system problems by throwing them into a one-time training and thinking we've checked the box and moved on. But we don't take a lens to actually the policies. We look at diversity and inclusion as this thing that's supposed to be like Instagram worthy. But what we don't think about is retention. What happens when people speak up? We see, for example, Black colleagues who speak up marginalized further and leave academia on a regular basis. We have to think about changing these structures and actually redesigning the system instead of just through educational means. Otherwise, the perfectionism is going to take over, and it's going to limit our ability to affect meaningful change.
I mean, one thing that I've noticed, just being getting more involved in just finishing my MPH at U of T and now going to medical school, getting to engage with the U of T Black Medical School Student Association and the great work that they do. But it seems like it's mostly students doing this advocacy work. Like you said, they kind of led the move for the defunding the police, Doctors for Defunding the Police movement. I guess, I mean, I'm sure I can guess the answer, but why does it seem like the students are the ones leading these kind of movements, and why does it go away after, when you go to medical school? Do you lose that there, and whether it's the Black students or non-Black students, what happens to that advocacy work?
Yeah, I mean, we have enough understanding in medical education to know that, for example, compassion is really high when people start their training, but as they go through the years of training, it's really low by the end of it. And it's to this point where we actually teach compassion out of people. And while there's more research that's needed around the particular aspects of advocacy, what I've seen anecdotally is that kind of happens in the same way. I think what's happening now is world movements, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, these conversations are happening in a way that some of these messages are resonating. These are things that people have been talking about for a long time. They're not new messages. They're just maybe being received a bit better. But I think that Black, Indigenous, people of color are being more assertive and in their asks, and we know what we want, and we want it now. And for example, the conversation about diversity and inclusion. Beware of organizations that talk about diversity and end at that, as a plan. That's a stopgap measure. That's not what we're talking about. Name anti-racism, name oppression, name discrimination, then we can talk. And it's that kind of pushing the line and pushing the precursor for conversation to that space where we're actually being anti-racist about it. And so I think that then this next generation of students, the future generation, is wide-eyed and has a vision that I'm latching myself onto, because I think that's the future, and that's where we need to move.
I think it's also really important to remember that the system is designed for people to not see the system, right? Particularly people that benefit from it. So when those are the folks who are in positions of power, you're by definition going to have a situation where your policies are going to be structurally racist and sexist and homophobic and transphobic, etc., because the people that rise to those positions of power don't have that lived experience, and then therefore are blind to that lived experience structurally. And so one of the big challenges that we have in trying to kind of bring an anti-racist or an anti-oppressive lens, even among folks that I think are well-intentioned, and in fact, this can be a challenge, as Javid mentioned, that in fact, they may not see themselves as biased, and that can be a barrier. But the biggest barrier actually is that they don't know what they don't know. And again, that's also true of South Asians in terms of the racism, I think, of Black folks and Indigenous folks. But I think remembering that the system is not broken. The system was built this way, and it's working to do exactly what it was built to do. It is benefiting certain people. It was built predominantly by, rich white men, and it is benefiting rich white men, straight white men, I'll add. So, and those are the people disproportionately in positions of power, and you see that in healthcare, you see that in policing, you'll see that in media, you see that in all of the systems that are around us. So the stories are shaped by those same groups, the policies are shaped by those same groups, and so I think what we're seeing now is probably just a slow trickling where people that don't fit that criteria are now starting to get into some of those positions of power and are starting to say things and are starting to shift things. And this has been building, right? This is all work that has been building for decades and centuries. And I know there was a question around how do you remain hopeful after such a disappointing vote? I think it's just, you have to believe in the power of social movement. The change that we're seeing, the conversation we're seeing today, where John Tory, who just a couple of years ago was caught on camera saying he didn't believe white privilege existed, is now talking about systemic anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism because the needle has shifted, what's socially acceptable has shifted, and maybe he's actually learned something. We don't know. But I think remembering that that's how the system is designed will actually really help us, even in terms of our frustration when we're trying to move things forward.
Then I guess my follow-up to that is, how do you get people in these positions of power, like whether they're white or South Asian or whatever, to unlearn these things? Like I don't think that you're going to get people to be involved unless they're willing to be involved. And like, just to get them to that level, it's so hard. I mean, in the schools that I've come from, like speaking anything about race or anything about, like sexual identity or something that's not part of the mainstream narrative, it's shut down pretty fast. So how do you, as students or as physicians or whatever, like how do you even get to those conversations and get people to listen?
I think it's about redefining power. So many times I see that activism dim over the clerkship year. And what I tell students who ask me all the time is, you may think that there's positional power, but let's think about all the other types of power that exist. There's power of expertise. There's power of lived experience. There's power of social influence. A student, by their very presence in a learning environment, can, through their presence, role model an anti-racist presence in a way that the people around them will catch on and adopt it. There's so much that we can do, and we should never underestimate the gentle power of, oh, wise preceptor, help me to understand why we're doing it this way when we know that this can have a negative impact in this way. The other thing is, I think research is another key. I know for me, early in my career, when I was burning out and I was feeling like I was just speaking up and no one was listening, research became a really important mechanism to actually add to a broader conversation and take a thoughtful approach to some of these problems and really demonstrate through that research, through that thought leadership, ways to do things differently. So there's a lot more that we can do, even though we feel like we get bogged down by the hierarchy. Students have a voice, but we're responsible for our ethnic racism. We have to really look in the mirror at ourselves and think about how we role model that kind of presence before we can start pointing fingers at anyone else.
Harsh, I think the team that you brought together to hold this event is doing just this. Listening, amplifying Black and Indigenous voices, learning about systemic racism and all the combinations and permutations of how systemic racism exists at different levels in our country. The focus of today's conversation is around healthcare, but there are many other spheres to talk about. And then finally, decolonizing your mind. Like, how are you, how am I, this is how I might ask myself, how am I benefiting from systemic racism? How am I a benefiter of Black and Indigenous racism, of white supremacy, and really learning to undo, to unthink, to move towards that anti-racist zone where I'm comfortable, giving space and not taking up space, giving positions of power to people who are Black and Indigenous, and amplifying those voices to mean something. And one last piece on this is to not conflate issues. We have a lot of issues in the South Asian community, for example, around caste systems, around class, around social hierarchy, around tone of our skin and dark and light, but this is the time right now is for anti-Black racism. This is the priority. This is what needs to be discussed, because Black and Indigenous people are dying in our communities, and that's what we need to focus on. We can have that discourse later, but that's what we need to focus on right now.
Yeah, I have a couple of follow-ups to that. One is like, I think people, like, my frustration is the only people that you'll like decolonizing your mind is such a radical kind of like thought for a lot of people that aren't involved in social justice work. Like they don't really understand what it even means. So how do you even get people who aren't, I guess, like looking for this kind of like change of their lens, or looking for this kind of, like personal growth? How do you even get those people to understand what you're trying to talk about, or understand how they're benefiting from the system? Like, I find it difficult talking to people my generation, people, my parents' generation, or whatever it is, just trying to get them even in these conversations in the first place. I don't know if I mean, it's hard, but
yeah, I was going to say, I think that that's the role that social movements play, is that they shift the needle, right? So I bring up John Tory's example because I think that's really notable. People are paying attention in a way that they weren't before, because they've kind of been forced to, because, what's socially acceptable, the social norms have shifted today from even 2 months ago in talking about anti-Black racism. People are even saying the term anti-Black racism, which was really not in the lexicon just very recently for most people. Why is it that we see a lot of the change being led by students? I think there is a generational piece there. If we look, for example, at education, that there has actually been a shift in the educational curriculum in Ontario that now talks about the history of genocide of Indigenous people and residential schools. That's not something that I learned when I went through the education system. So there's a shift in terms of what your generation is even coming into the conversations with. And certainly what I've seen in actually doing anti-oppression education in medical schools is that the students are way ahead of the faculty, because your general sort of the environment that you swim in is one that understands gender diversity. It understands feminism. It understands anti-racism to some extent, right? There's a lot more work to be done there, but I think the norms are different in different generations, and so I think you actually start from a different starting point. And so we see how in different medical schools across the country, a lot of the forward movement, the social justice oriented education changes, et cetera, are actually being led by the students. And I think as long as people are staying connected to those communities, are continuing to sort of stay informed and make sure that they're grounded, then I think you can continue that into your career. And you're also lucky that there's lots of folks, I think, that are publicly doing social justice work now in a way that wasn't the case even 5 or 10 years ago.
I guess I kind of like being like a cynic here, but I don't want to keep acting like nothing's changing. But we, like, as a student where I was in public health, or talking to Black medical students at U of T, at the end of the day, we are students, and like even when I was at Dalai Lama, like there's only a certain amount of power that we have to cause any kind of change. And so like it's just like we wait our turn to get in these positions of power, and even if we become a position we have power, we're not in the decision-making tables, like the executive level, or like the directors of the hospital and stuff. Like, we're not at those levels, whether it be South Asians or Black people. Like, it's just frustrating, I guess, to have to like wait our turn, I guess, and knowing that like you said, we are ahead of the curve or whatever, but it'd be nice to have like leadership from people who are in leadership positions, and it's just disappointing to see that that's not always the case.
I hear you, and I feel you. I do. I appreciate it. I understand it. I really want to challenge our thinking a bit though, because even being in those positions doesn't give power in the same way that the social movements we're seeing right now give power. You can do, 2 decades of research, but we're seeing a world that's being transformed because we've democratized access to information. It's through that democratization that things change. It's not 5 people in a room that's making decisions. It's the power of the people, as cliched as it sounds. What we've caught ourselves up in, and I think our South Asian communities experience this a lot, is this idea that there's a stigma against being too political. There's a stigma against rocking the boat. There's a stigma against speaking out. But what we don't appreciate is that our silence is in and of itself the most political thing that we can do. And that fear of rocking the boat and that fear of retribution, it's a real thing. I'm not saying that vulnerability doesn't matter. And I'm not saying that students should put themselves in a position where they're risking real harm from stepping up and speaking out. But I also think that it isn't until you tiptoe outside that comfort zone that you can begin to start seeing transformation happen. And it requires speaking up. It really does.
While I do appreciate that social movements are the basis of a lot of change in society, I think, Harsh, what you bring up is really important. And there are some of us who are Black, Indigenous people of color who do have positions of power. And with that power comes greater social responsibility than ever before to use that power to inspire change. And it behooves that leadership, and that time is now for that leadership more than any other time before. And I think student movements, like the ones we've talked about in this conversation, are lighting a fire under leaders and organizations so that we change the world, so that the next time we look at a health organization or university or whatever, Black, Indigenous people of color are not just, in the equity, diversity and inclusion office. They're actually in positions of power. And that's the kind of change that we're hoping to inspire. So I hear the frustration, and I look to people who are, Black, Indigenous people of color to not be silent, because that silence is violence in and of itself, to act out, to speak out, and be anti-racist.
I think I'm going to sound like a broken record, but again, this is how the system works. It leaves us feeling disempowered, right? The number of times I've met with somebody in a position of power where I think now I'm going to get change made because I'm having a meeting with this important person in a position of power, and their response is, I don't have the power to do this, right? So I think it's important for us to remember that all of us have our own sphere of influence, and we all have power in our own way. We all have less power than somebody else, but we also all have more power than somebody else. So speaking to one of the questions from the audience around what's been successful in implementing changes in systems, for me, one of the things that I often try to think about at any meeting that I'm in or any space where I might hold a position of leadership is who's not in this room and what would they need me to say right now. So there's a lot of those rooms that all of us are in. And while we may not always be in the one with the most power, we probably have more power than some other folks who didn't even make it into the room.
Yeah, I want to kind of push that question to you, Nahid and Javid, if like anything that you found successful in implementing kind of changes in the organizations where you work in or elsewhere.
Javid, you want to go first?
I was hoping you would go first for that one. It's a tough question. It really is, because I think I'm still figuring it out. I don't think that there's a manual. I don't think there's a guide. Sometimes I wish there was. One of the things I think I've had to really work on personally is being kinder to myself. I think that there's a lot of moral distress that many of us experience when we see opportunities for change. We want to change things, but we don't actually see things changing. And I think that can take a real toll. Like, I always draw myself back to Audre Lorde for inspiration when I'm having like one of those days. And this idea that self-care is a revolutionary act is so important. I think, when we talk about this idea of the imperfect self, we have to embrace the imperfect self. We have to practice self-forgiveness. No matter what you do, you're not going to ever be able to make everybody happy. We try to do that so often, right? How many times do we try to be the good? I know that for me, it's the cliche, good little boy, right? That's listening and respectful. But the truth is, you can still make change happen. What works and what doesn't work is going to be a lot of trial and error, one of the biggest things that I've always strived for is proactive mentorship, because I can never on my own understand and appreciate those blind spots. So a lot of times looking for people I trust to help me see past the gaslighting, see past the coercion really helps. But beyond that, it is a lot of listening and co-design. It's trying to bring an inclusive mindset, but also appreciating that that's not something I could ever have. I can never call myself an ally. It's not up to me to call myself an ally. That's just not what an ally is. The very definition of allyship is we don't get to call ourselves that.
Yeah, I want to say that, yelling at the top of my lungs has inspired change every single time I tried. It sometimes has, and it often hasn't. I think the one thing that we can probably all take under our belt and carry with us is to emulate and role model what being anti-racist in our spheres of influence, in our work, in our communities, what it looks like. And I always do put Rithika on the spot, and I'm so sorry, Rithika, I'm going to do it again. I was Rithika's medical student, and while I forget almost all the lectures I went to and attended around, different facets of medicine, I will never forget the trauma-informed approach that Rithika, displayed at bedside when caring for people, the way she has conversations, she speaks at eye level, the way she describes the people she cares for, the way she talks to other healthcare workers about the people she cares for. And, just mirroring that, emulating anti-racist behavior in our work, in our communities is so important. Your colleagues, your classmates, the people in your world may not fully understand it, but when they see you emulating behaviors, calling out power structures, asking questions about how we're benefiting from white supremacy, and anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism in our communities, people will be curious. They'll want to ask questions, and they'll hopefully want to emulate it. And I've had some commentary from colleagues in the past about how they've learned from just the role modeling of behavior in real time, and I think that's something to equip ourselves with.
I guess just a couple more questions before we wrap up. But in terms of there's the questions that came in about anti-Black racism in education, and whether that's in medical school or other types of education. Whether if that is a thing right now, I know there's a push right now to make anti-racism education and training mandatory across schools for faculty and students. But whether if that's actually a thing right now in schools or in the organizations you work with, or fellow physicians or other staff at your hospitals.
So this has been like my personal mission over the last 5 years, is to try to think about how we get anti-oppression education in medical and healthcare spaces. And we're absolutely nowhere near where we need to be. There are sort of some schools that are starting to do it for students. A big gap is faculty development, which is something that we're working on at U of T with the Center for Faculty Development, because of course, as I mentioned, there's a huge generational divide. And one of the big challenges is that some of these ideas that in fact may come as natural to trainees because they've soaked in the world at a different era might get actually removed from them when they go onto the wards, the hidden curriculum, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So I think we need a lot of across the board anti-oppression training for medical students, but we 100% also need that faculty development. We're not there, but I really, really believe that this moment is going to push us in a substantial way towards that.
Is there kind of the similar level of training for physicians, like with the patients they interact with?
Like anti-oppressive training for physicians?
Yeah.
No, not at all. In fact, it's the opposite of anti-oppressive training. In Ritika said, right, the hidden curriculum. I think I always tell people the hidden curriculum is hidden to some people, but it's very visible to other people. Part of why students are such powerful advocates is because it's not hidden to students. They see through it. They cross-sect with the entire sort of underbelly of the system, and they can see where these problems happen. It's just that they become conditioned to sort of absolve and become a part of that system. The question around education, the education system, I think that is such a huge part of how we develop, how we socialize, how these issues kind of become baked in our beliefs and how we internalize them. Again, particular to the South Asian communities, there's an internalization that happens around privilege and fragility that we're faced to reckon with, because a lot of our ancestors came here as economic migrants. They weren't brought here in the same ways. A lot of times we are put in positions of power with the explicit purpose of perpetuating racism, Black racism. So I think what we have to really think about as a community is that it goes beyond our own systems, it goes beyond education, it goes into the very fabric of our society. You know, if we think about the amount of kids that come to school hungry, if we think about child poverty, if we think about access to care, we have this great Canadian fantasy that we have this great Canadian system, right? That's part of our identity and we hold it so dear. But when we expose the fact that our existing system is actually perpetuating inequity in so many ways, people get uncomfortable. We get uncomfortable. And I think because our very identity in Canada is built around not being like those Americans or having a great system, having some of these conversations cuts at the very heart of who we are as a society.
And we have to remember ourselves that our medical education system still has textbooks that, you know, inaccurately teach medical students about skin cancers to the point where, you know, Black people are diagnosed late from various skin cancers. You know, I talked about the theories about thicker skin and pain medicine earlier in the session. And, you know, our textbooks still talk about, you know, Indigenous people being more likely to get, you know, conditions like tuberculosis, and then just stopping there, not digging any further at the roots of inequity, oppression, discrimination, and racism that have led to, you know, overrepresentation of certain populations with certain disease. And so, you know, surprisingly, you know, the world is at this point to have these conversations, but medicine just seems to be so far behind, and we have a long way to go. And just, you know, for viewers to be clear, that, you know, it is not standard in hospitals or community health organizations to get anti-racism and anti-oppressive, you know, training, and this is something that we need so badly.
Yeah, I guess just to wrap up, I don't want to comment on what GV was saying about the cyclical nature of oppression and something we talked about before, but and bringing it back to police brutality and anti-Black racism in police is the fact that we're kind of, and I don't want to take away from the movement at all, that's not what I'm trying to do, but the fact that we seem to be focusing on these mental health crises and not kind of getting to the root problem of the funding aspect that you talked about before, where why are these issues only coming up when it's like at a crisis moment? Like, we should be talking about funding services, access to care in these marginalized communities that are predominantly Black, Indigenous, people of color, poor communities. You know, like all the different social determinants of health that we learn about, but we don't actually do anything about when we put it in practice. So that's something I was thinking about when you were talking about it. But just kind of to wrap up, final thought from each of you on like the next steps of what we can do as South Asians, where this defunding the police movement is going after today when they voted down defunding 10%. Where if one of you guys want to talk about like what's happening next now that they voted on it, and just kind of a message or two to people to like what they can do next with this movement.
Sure. So specifically for that initiative, so our hope is to come together as a group to really look at how we can move forward and have other actions to continue to push. We've also talked about, as Naheed mentioned, it not being just about the ask around defunding the police, but that's the focus of the community right now. But really thinking about how we push for broader changes around addressing, you know, the structural issues, like actually talking about the lack of access of affordable housing or decent jobs, good minimum wages, et cetera, those broader issues. So I think we will continue to push for those pieces. And then I guess as a closing thought, I would just urge everybody to you know, really just kind of think about how you can spend a little bit of time learning a little bit more about what's happening and about Canada's history. I know one of the challenges that I had early on is that we consume so much American media and we often know a lot about particularly racism and the history of you know, anti-Black racism in the US, but there are really excellent resources now increasingly with Desmond Cole's book, Robin Maynard's book, that are talking about the specific history of anti-Black racism, slavery, segregation in Canada. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to take some time to look at those resources.
Yeah, I think a final thought to think about. We've talked about a lot of things at several different levels. There's definitely a lot to think about. I would say, really consider the sweet spot that you need to be in to be the most effective ally, to be anti-racist. It means, on one hand, balancing the desire and need to listen and amplify Black and Indigenous voices, to not take up too much space, to not conflate issues that are maybe more confusing, issues that may be more pressing as compared to those that have been within the South Asian community. And then on the flip side, being actively anti-racist and speaking out at the right times, being an effective ally. And that's a fine kind of balance to strike, but an important one to reflect on and think about it. And I think nobody really straddles that line perfectly. I think it's a constant journey of being on this side and that side and doing that dance. So do that dance and find that sweet spot to be the most effective anti-racist ally you can be.
Javi, you have a final thought?
I actually don't. I think that my colleagues kind of summed up everything I'm thinking. So thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you to everyone for tuning in. And I want to especially thank Dr. Ritika Goel, Dr. Naheed Dosani, and Dr. Javid Zukaira for joining us for the last hour and 20-ish minutes. It was a great conversation for me. I learned definitely a lot. And just want to leave a message for everyone tuning in. Just as Dr. Ibram X. Kendi said, like and we mentioned during this whole kind of webinar that being an anti-racist or ally is not like a final destination. It's a journey. You can't label yourself an ally, as we mentioned already. In fact, like you can be anti-racist in one moment and then be a racist the next moment. It's just continuously rethinking about our deeply held beliefs and re-examining the larger social arrangements that we support and we live in. Like tuning into this webinar is just one step. It's like listening and engaging in these conversations, but it's more important to start your own conversations with your friends and family and educating yourselves, as Ritika mentioned, reading some books, whether it's Desmond Cole, Robert Maynard's, Ibram Kendi's in the US about how to be an anti-racist, getting involved in local organizations and movements, donating to these organizations, getting involved in local politics, as we're seeing, a lot of people are getting very interested now with people tuning into the city council meeting today. And most importantly, just speaking up against racism and other injustices whenever you see it. So yeah, I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. I want to thank our speakers again. And we do have a bunch of resources I think it's in the bio. It should be, sorry, in the detail section of the YouTube video. It should be a PDF there of resources that we've linked for you guys to check out, whether it's documentaries or books or articles, research that we found. And we also have a survey that should be being distributed on our comment section for you guys to fill out if you just takes 5 minutes. But yeah, so stay tuned for our next event. Hopefully, should be in the coming weeks. And again, I want to thank Ritika, Naheed, and Javid for joining us today. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.